Hello, I'm Mark Baer. Welcome to the YourTown television show. My guest today, Dennis Taylor, journalist, freelance writer, icon on the Monterey Peninsula. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good to see you again.
You've been at this how many years?
52 years. I just turned 70. I started when I was 54 years. I started when I was 16 years old.
And you've been out here?
Professionally. I've been out here since 1997. Came out here to work for the Herald and worked there 18 and a half years.
So we're going to, before we even get to the Herald, before we get to the Monterey Peninsula, it turns out that you and I grew up at the same place at the same time in the Denver area, and we have a lot of shared childhood memories. We both remember Lionel Taylor and Frank Tripucka.
Yep.
And the miseries of the Broncos. I think we both remember AAA baseball.
Oh yeah,
with
Denver
the Denver
Bears,
you know.
Zephyrs. Yeah.
So these are, you know, and these are these marked our childhood.
And it was a wonderful time for me to grow up in Colorado. Man, I loved that place, and AAA baseball was a huge deal to me. I had the Baer Cup badge where you could watch the games for 50 cents with your dad.
I had the glove and the foul balls.
Yep. Man, you know, we were at a Denver Bears game, my father and I, one time. Somebody hit a line drive foul ball, and my dad, who was a good little athlete, and he was 55 at the time, reached up to catch this ball for me, and it hit him right on the end of the finger.
Oof.
And bounced over us and landed in the hands of a kid right behind us. And I was pissed off. You know, I was 10 years old and I was mad, and I kept turning around looking at this kid who had my ball. And you know, I don't really believe in miracles, but a few innings later, I don't remember if it was the same batter or who, but somebody else hit another line drive, just slicing toward us, and my dad, with his swollen purple finger, reached up and grabbed it.
Wow.
Handed it to me, and I thought, man, my hero. This guy was 5'6", and he was 10 feet tall to me my whole life.
So yeah, you know, it's so interesting. So we were just talking before this happened about the 1960 World Series. These are just indelible events in our lives.
Yeah.
Now, what's happened in the last 10 years, 20 years, I can't, you know, I can barely remember, but they didn't impact me like what we did growing up. But also, you had you were a bit of a deviant as well. So let's after my own heart. So let's begin at the beginning and how you got into journalism and why you and why not your friend. And let's.
I had to think about this. I got asked to speak to a class one day at CSU Monterey Bay, and the teacher said, I said, I'm not sure what to talk about. And she said, why don't you just tell us how you got into journalism? So I had to think about this for a while, and I traced it back to when I was 11 or 12 years old. I had a best friend named Fred Lamry, who was a diabolical, evil genius when he was 11 or 12 years old. That was one trait of Fred Lamry. And the other trait is that if anybody remembers Pat Paulson, the dog-faced comedian who's on the Smothers Brothers and Laugh-In and those things, and he ran for president. One of the ugliest men who ever lived, I think. Fred Lamry, when he was 11 years old, looked exactly like Pat Paulson. So he was very recognizable in our little tiny town. It's 100 degrees one day, or 90 something, felt like 100. And Fred and I rode our bicycles up to our little tiny shopping mall in this town of probably 500 people at the time. And it was like a strip mall, and we were just going to buy a bottle of pop because it was so hot outside, and we veered our bicycles into the alley between the two ends of the strip mall, past the dumpsters where all the loading docks were and stuff. And Fred, who just had a mind like nobody else, he was a straight A student, by the way, but he noticed this stack of pallets next to this dumpster and a plastic bucket, and immediately his mind went right where I expected it to go. He said, okay, I got an idea. I think we can get on the roof if we stack all these pallets on the dumpster, and let's fill this plastic bucket with water, and we'll climb up there and we'll wait for some kid to walk by, and we'll dump the water on his head. So we did that, and we're sitting on the roof, on this tar roof, and it's 90 some degrees, and no kids are coming by within range. Our plan is failing, and we were up there probably 20, 30 minutes and couldn't stand it anymore, and we're just about ready to give up. And Fred spots a vent, some kind of vent on the roof of Pittman Printing, and so we start taking our coins and unscrewing this thing, and we peeled it off, and it was the fan, and we bent the fan all up. It was the fan right over the toilet. And I looked at Fred, and Fred looked at me, and Fred said, I got a better idea. He said, let's get off the roof, we'll go over to the grocery store, and we'll buy a bag of flour. And then, so we'll have flour and water. So we did that. We went and bought a bag of Hungarian flour, climbed back on the roof, and we sat up there for another 20 minutes, and Mr. Pittman, owner of Pittman Printing, who is this German guy about 6'3".
And Pittman Printing is a big deal. This is not a little...
In our town, it was a big deal.
Yeah.
In our town, it was a big deal. But he was 6'3" and 240 pounds. That's how I remember this guy. He was a behemoth. Drops his drawers, sits down on the toilet. This is how I got into journalism, by the way. We waited for him to get good and settled. He's reading his magazine. I poured the entire bucket of water through this hole onto his head, and Fred, right behind me, dumps the whole bag of Hungarian flour right on top of him, and he thought the roof fell in. He looked straight up and went, "Oh!" and stood up with his pants down, and I wasn't waiting for Fred, man, I was running. And so I jumped off the roof onto the pallets, and the pallets tipped over when I landed on them. I had a nice soft landing, and they tipped over and fell off the dumpster, and I jumped on my bike and took off. Fred came right behind me, and he had to land on the Baer dumpster, so he had a harder landing. And I wasn't paying attention to where he was. I was saving my own butt. And Mr. Pittman figured out what was happening during this time, and he ran out the back door into the alley. And so I was just past him when he came running out. And so I got just a glimpse of him, peripheral vision, and he's just covered in white. And he's so mad. So he kind of watches the back of my head as I'm pumping off on my little Stingray bicycle. And Fred is behind me. And Fred had to veer around Mr. Pittman to get by him. And Fred, who looks like Pat Paulson, and everybody, he's very recognizable. So fast forward, 4 years later, 5 years later, Fred and I are sitting in our sophomore English class, and the editor of the local newspaper, the weekly newspaper, comes in, gives us a talk about the newspaper business, and afterwards he pulls our English teacher aside and he said, "Say, do you have anybody in your class who's a pretty good writer and also really into sports?" Oh, that was me. I lived for sports. I had been writing sports stories for my little table baseball games, for years. And she said, "Yes, I do. Fred Lamry." And I'm sitting there thinking, what am I, chopped liver here? So Fred, he's iffy about it from the very beginning, but then Fred realizes that Pittman Printing has moved, and it now shares the building, the office, with the Broomfield Star, the newspaper. He decides he can't go in there because Mr. Pittman, 4 years later, is going to recognize him immediately, and he's probably right. So he never went in and asked for the job. I did. And the editor of the paper says, "Okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to cover your high school football game this weekend. It's the last game of the year, and I want you to write me a column and a game story. It won't get in the paper. I just want to see how you do." The paper came out on Thursday. So I did that, handed it in on Monday, went home. Thursday I pick up the Broomfield Star, and both of my articles are in there. And that's how my journalism career started. Fred Fred ended up dropping out of high school, straight A student, dropped out of high school, had a drug problem, went to Vietnam, got hepatitis, came back, had a drinking problem, and drank until his liver failed, and that was the end of Fred Lamry. So that was, we had two very divergent paths, but
just because you were faster and jumped quicker.
and probably far more of a coward, yeah.
So that brings us, okay, we're at 1972, and you've got the Denver Broncos. So how did that start?
In 1971, right out of high school, I was supposed to go to the University of Missouri for journalism, and my mother had just died, and I was still a little boy in my head, so I really didn't want to leave Colorado and go to Missouri. And serendipitously, my editor at the Broomfield Star knew an editor at the Longmont Times-Call where they had a sports opening. And he called and said, I got this talented kid. He's only 18 years old, but you ought to look at him. The editor of that paper called me up and asked me to drive over there, which 30 miles, to interview. And I drove 30 miles, interviewed, got the job at the Longmont Times-Call, had a flat tire on the way, walked in with crud all over my face and my hands. And I think that's probably, he felt sorry for me and hired me. But one of my jobs in 1971 with the Longmont Times-Call was to start covering the Denver Broncos at Mile High Stadium. And so I did that every week and got to go to training camp, all that kind of stuff. I did that from 1971 until 1997.
And let's talk about that. What I remember most was the old uniforms, the black and was it black and orange or something?
Originally,
yeah,
the cream-colored jerseys and black pants.
The black pants.
Yeah.
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 And then
that gave away to the bright orange and the.
Well, that was much later, but
yeah.
Yeah. And we suffered because they were usually awful.
Awful. Yeah.
And it's so funny that the games of then are still so redolent in my head, and all of adult life I can't remember.
And by the way, they packed the house even when they were terrible.
Oh yeah. Let's get you to the Herald. So,
okay.
So then you're in Monterey, and you've had 18 years of. So let's just talk about that experience.
Sure. I came to the Herald in 1997 from the Greeley Tribune, which was started by Horace Greeley, by the way. I had worked there 14 years. Came out to interview for the Herald for the second time. I had interviewed there 10 years earlier, and they hired somebody from the Fort Collins paper instead, who I ended up working with at the Herald 10 years after that. So in 1997, I started at the Herald. I was a sports writer. I wrote columns there. I covered high school sports. I covered the San Francisco 49ers. I drove to San Francisco one time to interview Chris Dahlman, Palma High School coach now, who was their starting center at the time. And my approach to him was not to talk about the game so much, but get his memories of playing at Palma High, now that he's a San Francisco 49ers starter on a Super Bowl bound team.
Yeah, wow.
That was my angle with him. And I always try and look for a different kind of angle, a little twist, something that localizes it, because that's what I'm trained to do.
Let's just talk about some of the people that you've interviewed over the years here.
Well, I covered the AT&T Pebble Beach Pro-Am for all 18 years that I was with the Herald, almost all 18 years. And I was always kind of the loose cannon in the newsroom, and so they'd send me over to cover the celebrities rather than the golfers. And so that was my beat, and that was a really fun beat. I interviewed Donald Trump and Rush Limbaugh the same week. I interviewed Mark Wahlberg, Michael Douglas. I didn't interview this guy, but I was sitting on a bench kind of going through my notes, and Samuel L. Jackson sat next to me, and we had a conversation. I also met Jack Lemmon one night on the putting green. He was walking his dog, and I got to have a conversation with him. And you know, what a thrill that was, you know, being our age. Let's see, who else? The comedians. Ray Romano. I tried to get Ray Romano to talk to me after his golf game. He is exactly, in real life, the way he is when you see him on TV. He is just so dour. Friendly but dour. And No, no, no. I had a bad day on the golf course. I don't want to talk to you, man. I just need 5 minutes, Ray. I'm on deadline. You know, I won't take any more time than that. My caddy and he's taking me over to the lodge. I said, okay, you know, I understand. And he goes, oh, crap. He said, and he reached over and he grabbed my pants by the two sides. He's sitting in the golf cart and he yanks me backwards onto his lap and looks at his caddy, and the caddy drives off. And I'm sitting on Ray Romano's lap with my tape recorder, interviewing him like this. All the way to the lodge, and then he pushes me off his lap, kind of abruptly, and he said, you got what you need? And I said, yes, I do, thank you.
It is a little bit like the front page.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's truth to that movie. Yeah,
yeah, isn't it fun? So, I mean, did you ever imagine this life that you've had?
No, and you know, it's only a little white lie when I tell people that I've never worked a day in my life.
Right.
You know, there have been times that have been a grind, but there's lots of times when it's a grind. But it's just so enjoyable.
Well, when we come back, we're going to go into depths about some of the more interesting interviews that you've done. I'm Mark Baer. You're watching the YourTown television show, and we'll be back for part 2 momentarily. Hold on.